What if the greatest crime ever committed was not an act of violence, not a war, not a betrayal, but something far more ordinary, something so deeply woven into the fabric of our lives that we rarely, if ever, question it? What if the true crime is birth itself? From the moment we open our eyes, the world greets us with a story of hope, of progress, of family and legacy. We are told that life is a gift, that to bring a child into the world is the highest act of love. We celebrate new beginnings, we immortalize the innocence of newborns, and we build entire civilizations on the promise of tomorrow. But beneath the surface of this comforting narrative, a darker question lingers, one that most of us are too afraid to ask. What if everything we've been told about life is a carefully constructed illusion? What if the relentless march of human existence, the endless cycle of birth and death, is not a triumph, but a tragedy? What if, in our desperate pursuit of meaning, we have overlooked the possibility that to create life is to condemn another being to suffering, uncertainty, and eventual decay? This is not a question for the faint of heart. It is a question that shakes the very foundation of society, that challenges the sanctity of family, the purpose of progress, and the meaning of love itself. It is a question that has haunted philosophers, poets, and skeptics for centuries, lurking in the shadows of our collective consciousness. Tonight, we invite you to step into that shadow, to look beyond the comforting myths and confront the possibility that the greatest taboo is not the end of life, but its beginning. Are we brave enough to question the sanctity of life itself? Or will we turn away, clinging to the stories that keep us safe from the abyss? The crime of existence. The trial begins now. Long before the word antinatalism was ever spoken, the seeds of doubt had already been sown in the minds of humanity's greatest thinkers. The question of whether life is a blessing or a burden is as old as civilization itself. In the ancient tragedies of Sophocles, we find a chilling echo of this doubt. In his play Oedipus at Colonus, a chorus of elders proclaims, "Not to be born is best when all is reckoned." The sentiment is stark, almost unthinkable, that the greatest fortune is never to have existed at all. This ancient pessimism is not confined to Greek drama. In the Hebrew Bible, the book of Ecclesiastes laments, "I declare that the dead, who had already died, are happier than the living, who are still alive. But better than both is the one who has never been born." Here, the weight of suffering, the futility of toil, and the inevitability of death cast a long shadow over the supposed gift of life. Centuries later, the German philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer would give this shadow a philosophical form. For Schopenhauer, existence is defined by suffering. Desire is endless, satisfaction fleeting, and peace is found only in the absence of striving. He wrote, "If children were brought into the world by an act of pure reason alone, would the human race continue to exist?" Schopenhauer's answer was clear. Reason, unclouded by illusion, would choose non-existence. But antinatalism is not simply a rejection of life. It is paradoxically an act of empathy, a refusal to inflict suffering on another conscious being. It is a philosophy born not from hatred, but from compassion for the pain that consciousness inevitably brings. The 20th century would see this ancient thread woven into the work of Emil Cioran, a Romanian philosopher whose writings shimmer with both despair and dark beauty. Cioran was not content to merely observe the suffering of the world. He lived it, breathed it, and transformed it into haunting prose. For Cioran, the burden of existence was not just personal, but universal. "It is not worth the bother of killing yourself," he wrote, "since you always kill yourself too late." Cioran's voice is different from the cold logic of Schopenhauer or the resigned sorrow of Ecclesiastes. His words are poetic, almost seductive, inviting us to see the world through the eyes of one who has stared into the abyss and found, not horror, but a strange kind of freedom. In his universe, to question birth is not an act of despair, but a gesture of honesty, a refusal to participate in the great lie that suffering is justified by the mere fact of existence. As we trace the roots of antinatalism, we see that it is not a philosophy of death, but a philosophy of radical empathy. It asks us to look unflinchingly at the reality of suffering and to ask ourselves, is it right to create life, knowing what life inevitably brings? In the words of Cioran, is it not a form of madness to wish to perpetuate a world so manifestly doomed to failure? The stage is set. The question lingers. Why do we continue to create life when so many have warned us of its cost? To understand antinatalism in its most poetic and unsettling form, we must step into the world of Emil Cioran, a world shaped by insomnia, exile, and the relentless ache of consciousness. Born in a small village in Romania in 1911, Cioran's early years were marked by a sense of alienation that would never leave him. He wandered through the landscapes of Europe, eventually settling in Paris, where he would spend decades as a self-imposed exile, writing in a language that was not his own. Cioran's nights were long and sleepless. He once confessed, "I've never been able to write a line in the daytime." Insomnia was not just a condition for him. It was a way of being, a state in which the mind is stripped of its illusions and forced to confront the raw, unfiltered reality of existence. In these endless nights, Cioran wrote aphorisms that cut through the fabric of hope like a surgeon's scalpel. It is not worth the bother of killing yourself, since you always kill yourself too late, he mused, capturing the paradox of despair, the knowledge that even escape is futile. For Cioran, hope was not a virtue, but a cruel trick played by nature. He saw in hope the seeds of disappointment, in desire the roots of suffering. The fact that life has no meaning is a reason to live. Moreover, the only one, he wrote, turning the absence of meaning into a kind of dark liberation. Cioran's philosophy was not about resignation, but about seeing clearly, about stripping away the comforting lies that shield us from the abyss. Yet, there is a strange comfort in Cioran's bleakness. His words do not simply drag us down into despair. They invite us to find a peculiar freedom in letting go of illusions. In a world obsessed with progress and positivity, Cioran's refusal to look away from suffering feels almost heroic. He does not offer solutions or salvation. Instead, he offers honesty, a rare and unsettling gift. Cioran's charisma lies in his ability to articulate what so many feel but cannot say. He gives voice to the silent terror that haunts the edges of consciousness, the suspicion that existence itself is a mistake, that to be born is to be condemned. And yet, in his writing, there is also a kind of beauty, a recognition that, in facing the darkness, we might discover a new kind of light. To read Cioran is to stand at the edge of the abyss and not flinch. It is to acknowledge the futility of hope, the cruelty of consciousness, and the seductive allure of non-existence. But it is also to realize that, in the end, despair can be strangely liberating. For those who dare to look into the void, Cioran offers not comfort, but clarity, a way of seeing the world that is as honest as it is. Unsettling. In the philosophy of Emil Cioran, we find not just despair, but the courage to face it, and in that courage, perhaps, a glimmer of freedom. If the logic of antinatalism is so clear, if suffering is inevitable, and existence itself is fraught with pain, why do we, as a species, continue to create life? Why do we bring children into a world we know is uncertain, often cruel, and always finite? To answer this, we must turn from philosophy to psychology and examine the hidden forces that drive us to perpetuate the cycle. At the most basic level, the urge to reproduce is written into our DNA. Evolution has shaped us to desire offspring, to pass on our genes, to ensure the survival of our lineage. This drive is older than reason, older than civilization itself. But biology alone cannot explain the intensity with which we pursue parenthood, nor the elaborate rituals and stories we build around it. Society, too, plays its part. From the moment we are born, We are surrounded by narratives that glorify family, legacy, and the miracle of birth. Fairy tales end with happily ever after and the promise of children. Religions sanctify parenthood, painting it as a sacred duty. Even in secular cultures, the idea of leaving a mark, of being remembered through our descendants, offers a kind of immortality. To have children is to defy death, to assert that our story will continue even after we are gone. But beneath these stories lie powerful psychological mechanisms that keep us from questioning the cycle. Denial is one of the most potent. We know, intellectually, that life is hard, that suffering is inevitable. Yet we convince ourselves that our children will be different, that they will be happy, that the world will be kinder to them. This is optimism bias at work. The tendency to believe that the future will be better, that our own experience will defy the odds. There is also the myth of progress, the belief that humanity is on an upward trajectory, that each generation will live better than the last. This myth is reinforced by media, by education, by the very structure of our societies. It is a comforting story, one that makes the act of bringing new life into the world feel not just justified, but noble. But what if these stories are not truths, but propaganda? What if the glorification of parenthood is less about love and more about control? The concept of natalist propaganda suggests that societies have a vested interest in encouraging reproduction. More citizens mean more workers, more soldiers, more consumers. Media, religion, and culture work together to make parenthood seem inevitable, even heroic, while those who question are cast as selfish, broken, or even dangerous. Studies show that people who choose not to have children are often stigmatized, their motives questioned, their happiness doubted. Doubt itself becomes taboo. The machinery of society is designed to keep us from asking the most fundamental question: why do we create life at all? Through interviews with psychologists, sociologists, and those who have chosen a child-free life, a different picture emerges. Parenthood is not always a conscious choice, but often a default, an expectation so deeply ingrained that to question it feels like heresy. The desire for children is shaped not just by love, but by fear. Fear of loneliness, fear of meaninglessness, fear of being forgotten. And yet, when we peel back the layers of biology, culture, and psychology, we are left with a stark truth. The decision to create life is not just personal, but profoundly ethical. To bring a child into the world is to make a wager with fate, a wager that suffering will be outweighed by joy, that existence is better than non-existence. But what if that wager is not ours to make? What if, in our rush to create, we have overlooked the cost? The psychology of birth is not just a story of love and hope, but also of denial, fear, and the power of myth. And until we are willing to question those myths, the cycle will continue, unbroken, unquestioned, and perhaps unforgivable. Imagine, for a moment, that society itself is on trial. The charge: complicity in a crime against the unborn. The courtroom is not a place of law, but of conscience. The jury is not a panel of peers, but the collective weight of human history. The question before us is simple, yet shattering. Is it ethical to create life, knowing that suffering is inevitable? The prosecution begins with a thought experiment. Imagine a world where every potential parent must ask for the consent of their future child before bringing them into existence. The absurdity is immediate. How can someone consent to being born when they do not yet exist? And yet, this is the very heart of the antinatalist argument. To create life is to impose existence, with all its pain and uncertainty, on someone who had no say in the matter. Real-world legal cases have begun to echo this philosophical dilemma. In recent years, wrongful life lawsuits have emerged, where children born with severe disabilities have sued their parents or doctors for allowing them to be born. These cases force us to confront the uncomfortable reality that birth is not always a blessing, and that the act of creation can, in some circumstances, be seen as a harm. The defense, of course, is quick to respond. Life, they argue, is not just suffering. It is also joy, love, discovery, and meaning. To deny existence is to deny the possibility of happiness, of beauty, of transcendence. The potential for suffering, they say, does not outweigh the potential for fulfillment. But the prosecution presses on. Can any amount of happiness truly justify the certainty of pain? Is it ethical to gamble with another's fate simply because we hope the odds will be in their favor? Contemporary antinatalists, like philosopher David Benatar, argue that the asymmetry between pain and pleasure is decisive. The absence of pain is good, even if no one benefits from it. The absence of pleasure is not bad, unless someone is deprived of it. In other words, not being born spares one from suffering without depriving anyone of happiness. This logic, unsettling as it may be, challenges the very foundation of our moral reasoning. Society, meanwhile, stand in the dock, its values under scrutiny. Family, legacy, progress. These are the pillars upon which civilizations are built. But what if these pillars rest on a foundation of denial? What if our most cherished ideals are, in fact, rationalizations for a cycle of suffering we are too afraid to question? The trial grows tense. Witnesses are called, parents who regret their decision, children who wish they had never been born, philosophers who argue that non-existence is preferable to a life of pain. The defense calls its own, parents who find meaning in their children, individuals who have overcome suffering to achieve greatness, thinkers who insist that life, for all its flaws, is still worth living. The jury, us, the viewers, are left to deliberate. Is it ethical to create life without consent? Can suffering ever be justified by the hope of happiness? Or are we, as a society, complicit in a crime we refuse to name? As the trial draws to a close, the verdict remains uncertain. The questions linger, unresolved, echoing in the silence that follows. Perhaps the true crime is not in the act of creation, but in our refusal to confront its consequences. Perhaps the greatest taboo is not death, but the unexamined sanctity of birth itself. The trial of society is not over. It is only just beginning. In the 21st century, the ancient doubts of Cioran and his philosophical ancestors have found new life in a world teetering on the edge of crisis. The questions that once haunted the margins of intellectual debate now echo through the anxieties of a generation facing unprecedented challenges. Climate change, ecological collapse, and the specter of overpopulation have transformed the act of bringing a child into the world from a private decision into a public dilemma. Across continents, young people are choosing voluntary childlessness, not out of selfishness or nihilism, but out of a deep sense of responsibility. For some, the future appears so uncertain, so fraught with risk, that to create new life feels like an act of cruelty rather than hope. Online, entire communities have formed around the principles of antinatalism. Forums, social media groups, and viral movements like #BirthStrike and #StopHavingKids have given voice to a growing disillusionment with the promises of progress and the myth of endless growth. These digital spaces are not just echo chambers of despair. They are places where people share stories, debate ethics, and find solidarity in their doubts. Yet the backlash is fierce. Mainstream culture, still deeply invested in pronatalist values, often responds with ridicule, suspicion, or outright hostility. To question the sanctity of birth is to challenge the very core of what society holds sacred. The psychological toll of antinatalist thinking is real. For some, it brings alienation, a sense of being out of step with the world. For others, it leads to depression as the weight of existence becomes too much to bear. But there is also, paradoxically, a strange sense of freedom. To reject the obligation to create life is to reclaim agency over one's own existence, to step outside the machinery of expectation and tradition. As the world grows more uncertain, the voices of antinatalism grow louder. Are they a symptom of a society in decline, A collective cry of despair from a generation that has lost faith in the future? Or are they a rational response to an unlivable world, a final act of empathy in the face of overwhelming odds? The answer, perhaps, lies not in philosophy or psychology, but in the choices we make and the courage to question what we have always taken for granted. As we approach the heart of the antinatalist argument, we find ourselves standing at the edge of a paradox, a question that has haunted philosophers, poets, and ordinary people alike. Can we live without illusions? Can we survive, or even thrive, without the comforting myths of hope, progress, and legacy that have shaped human existence for millennia? Emil Cioran believed that hope is both a blessing and a curse. It is hope that keeps us moving forward, that allows us to endure suffering and disappointment. Yet, it is also hope that blinds us to the reality of our condition, that tempts us to ignore the inevitability of pain and loss. Chaos is rejecting all you have learned, Cioran wrote. Chaos is being yourself. To reject hope is to step into chaos, to face the world as it truly is, without filters, without fantasies. Psychological research suggests that illusions are not just comforting. They are in many ways necessary. Studies show that people who see the world with brutal honesty often struggle with depression and anxiety. Optimism, even when unfounded, can be a powerful tool for survival. But what happens when the cost of these illusions becomes too high? When the stories we tell ourselves no longer protect us, but instead trap us in cycles of suffering and denial? The paradox is clear. To live without illusions is to risk despair, but to live with them is to risk self-deception. Is there a way to embrace the truth of existence, the suffering, the uncertainty, the absence of ultimate meaning, without falling into nihilism? Can we find beauty in the very act of seeing clearly, in the courage it takes to face reality without flinching? Cioran's answer is both bleak and strangely hopeful. He suggests that meaning is not something we inherit, but something we create in the face of meaninglessness. To live without illusions is not to give up on life, but to accept it on its own terms, to find freedom in honesty, and even a kind of joy in the acceptance of despair. In the end, the paradox of hope is not a problem to be solved, but a tension to be lived. It is the space between comfort and clarity, between illusion and truth, where the most profound questions of existence reside. And it is here, in this uncertain space, that we must decide for ourselves. Can we live without illusions? Or are we, in the end, creatures of hope, forever seeking light in the darkness? As we reach the end of this journey, the images of life's cycle, birth, laughter, struggle, loss, linger in our minds. We have traveled through the shadows of philosophy and the depths of psychology, confronted the myths that shape our choices, and placed society itself on trial. We have listened to the voices of ancient pessimists and modern skeptics, and we have stood at the edge of the abyss with Emil Cioran, peering into the darkness that lies beneath the surface of existence. What have we found there? Not easy answers, but unsettling questions. Not comfort, but the possibility of clarity. In a world that urges us to look away from suffering, to cling to hope and tradition, it takes a rare kind of courage to ask, what if everything we have been taught about life, family, and progress is not the truth, but a story designed to keep us moving forward, no matter the cost? True courage is not found in the refusal to doubt, but in the willingness to question everything, even the sanctity of life itself. It is the courage to look at the world without illusions, to see both its beauty and its brutality, and to accept that meaning is not given, but made. It is the courage to ask, what if the greatest act of love is not to create, but to understand? Perhaps, in the end, the value of antinatalism is not in its answers, but in its questions. It challenges us to examine the foundations of our beliefs, to confront the realities we would rather ignore, and to find meaning not in the act of creation, but in the act of understanding. It invites us to see the world as it is, and to choose, with open eyes, how we will live within it. As the credits begin to roll, the conversation does not end. The questions linger, echoing in the silence that follows. Will we turn away, seeking comfort in familiar stories? Or will we dare to look deeper, to question more, to seek understanding even in the face of uncertainty? The courage to question everything is not a destination, but a journey, one that each of us must walk alone and together. The trial of existence continues. The verdict, as always, is still to be decided.